All right, welcome back. Chapter 9, Waste Management. We've already discussed water pollution and the Clean Water Act, air pollution, the Clean Air Act, and global air pollution. And now it's time to talk about solid waste. What do we do with solid waste? So uh, let's just jump right into this. We'll talk about the waste management problem, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act of 1976, the year I was born, Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation and Liability Act 1980, referred to as CERCLA, and more commonly known as Superfund. Um, a lot there, but I'm going to go through it fairly quickly. I'll have another video that you can watch too, a YouTube video about this one and how that came about. But let's get into the waste management problem. So on average, each person uses about or produces about 4.5 pounds of solid waste per day. Now this includes all waste, industrial waste, everything. So if you were to add up all the waste that all people produce, all industry produces, and divide it by the number of people in this country, the 4.5, it comes out to be about 4.5 pounds. That's a lot of waste, right? So if you multiplied that out per day by 380 million people or whatever it is in our population is in the country by day for the entire year, it comes out to be a pretty astronomical amount. There's a lot of waste out there, right? And what do we do with all this stuff? What happens to all this stuff? And what's regulating all of this stuff? So this includes about all of our household garbage, which is about 55 to 65% of that, including the industrial waste and construction and biomedical and all of that. Household waste is about 1% of hazardous waste, or waste that's considered hazardous to human health. Most hazardous waste comes from industry, and it amounts to about, as of 1999, which is out of date, it amounts to about 46 million tons per year. Think about that, 46 million tons, and it's only gone up since 1999. Why is this such a problem? Of course, this leads to pollution. This leads to landfills and the lack of space for more landfills and contaminated water and so forth. So there is a crisis in our country, a landfill crisis, where from 1988 to 1999, 70% of our nation's landfills have closed. Now, this is mostly due to tighter restrictions, restrictions that protect us from our own garbage, right? Now, we have space for more landfills. There's plenty of space, but there's this idea of NIMBY, the not in my backyard type concept. We don't want, and I don't want to live next to a landfill. And we'll talk about after this lecture how this relates to environmental justice, that a lot of minority communities and poor communities are subject to having to live by these areas, these types of areas, because they can't necessarily leave, and they're disproportionately impacted by the pollution created from these sites. Now, instead, we tend to have these large-scale, massive landfills. And if any of you are from this area and you've been through, Hartford or Connecticut or wherever you live, you've probably seen the large, kind of industrial-level landfills. There's all sorts of environmental safeguards to prevent decomposing garbage and the chemicals associated with that leaking into our landfills or into our aquifers, or running off of the landfill. They're pretty technical, or they have a lot of good technology that prevents that from happening. But it's becoming more and more of a problem. Where we put this garbage, especially as the country grows, it's a serious health problem and somewhat of a crisis, if you will. Now, so to deal with solid waste, in 1976, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act was passed. Now, the RCRA has four goals. It defines waste for classification. It creates a tracking system from cradle to grave of that waste. So when it was created and then when it was reclaimed and become inert or decontaminated, if you will. Handling and disposal requirements of the waste, and authority for mandatory cleanup if it gets spilled. So let me take a drink here real quick. So the RCRA really is meant to establish or to meet these four goals in regards to solid waste management. However, there are some exceptions to this. So the RCRA was passed to regulate solid waste, but there are some exceptions, and let me tell you about these exceptions. It does not cover sewage, and so even though there's solid waste and sewage, it does not cover sewage. That's regulated under the Clean Water Act. It does not cover mine waste or nuclear waste. Now, there's a double exception to that. Nuclear waste is regulated under the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and mine waste is regulated under the Metallic Minerals Waste Management Act and the Land Reclamation Act. However, stored waste on site can be regulated under the Clean Water Act, and potential for disaster of, and we've talked about this already, of stored mining tailings in ponds leaking out into the environment and causing problems. The Clean Water Act gets involved there. And there are aspects of the Resource Conservation Recovery Act in dealing with how mine waste is utilized on site, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. Municipal garbage, even though I keep talking about municipal garbage and then referring to the RCRA, it's not regulated until it makes it to the landfill. The garbage, when it's at your house, it's still your private property. Even though you're going to get rid of it, it's still private property. You're responsible for it. So if you pile a bunch of garbage out in your backyard and it's leaching out into the ground and contaminating, you're going to be responsible for that as an individual. You put it out on the curb and the truck comes by and picks it up. Municipal garbage is now regulated under the RCRA. Once it goes to the landfill or the transfer station. And irrigation waste. So water that's flowing off of irrigated fields carries solids with it. That's regulated under the Clean Water Act, under Section 303, the TMDL process, the Total Maximum Daily Load process, rather than the RCRA. Now, the RCRA also, I should mention, in some cases regulates water or liquid waste, because there's a potential loophole that a industry could convert their solid waste into a liquid and discharge it under the Clean Water Act. The Resource Conservation Recovery Act prevents that from happening by regulating both the solid and the liquid form of that particular waste. And then there's some exceptions to add to this. Oh, actually, I mentioned that. Oh, contradictions. Okay, so the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, FIFRA. I warned you that the federal government loves acronyms and big names, but this statute, this act, FIFRA, allows certain pesticides to be applied to plants, and the pesticides are regulated under FIFRA, but the barrel in which the pesticide is stored is regulated by the RCRA. So if you're a farmer and you're utilizing large amounts of chemicals to protect your crops, you're dealing with multiple statutes, which can be very complicated. Okay. Not sure why I had that image in there, but there you go. There's a couple of other loopholes and some major key cases, legal cases, in regards to the RCRA. And the first one was the American Mining Congress versus the EPA in 1990. And then there was another one, the American Petroleum Institute versus the EPA, also in 1990. And essentially what the results of these cases were, or let me give you a background here. There was the American Mining Congress was arguing that smelter waste of aluminum, copper, lead, zinc, other alloys is not, from large mining operations, that the waste left behind was not actually waste if it was reused. So if they're reusing it for, extracting the water to reutilize in part of the leaching process, or whatever. I don't really completely understand how they recycle it, but they do. And if they recycle it, they were claiming that it's not waste. And if it's not waste, then it can't be managed under the RCRA, right? That they're kind of off the hook. And the courts actually sided with the American Mining Congress and said, yeah, if you're still using it, it's not considered waste. So it seems like the American Mining Congress was off the hook at this point. However, the courts also claimed that the sludge or the slurry had to be reused within 90 days. So there was a fear that that mining companies would just say that all this waste is going to be reused, therefore it's not waste, and it would sit there for a couple of decades and potentially lead to environmental disaster. So the EPA or the courts on this part said that, yeah, even though we're siding with you that it's not waste if it's reused, it has to be reused within 90 days. If it's not reused within 90 days, it's waste. It has to be processed. The American Petroleum Institute versus the EPA in 1990 also was a lawsuit that claimed that once the waste or claimed waste was no longer waste once it arrives at a reclamation center. So eventually all this stuff has to be reclaimed and detoxified. And once it's dropped off at that reclamation center, the American Petroleum Institute was saying that it's not waste anymore. In this case, the court sided with the EPA and said that's not true. Once it's your waste, it's always your waste until it's completely reclaimed. So even though somebody else has it now and is dealing with it and reclaiming it, it's still waste, it's still yours, and it's still your problem. This is part of that cradle to grave requirement of the RCRA, right here. This tracking system, that it always follows you. If you create waste, it's going to be yours until the end, until it's reclaimed, so that you can't walk away from it and claim responsibility on somebody else. There's also, just to add here, there's another or an amendment to the RCRA called the Hazardous and Solid Waste Amendments of 1984, and this is where the reduce, reuse, recycle came from. These are part of the amendment. It raised the cost of solid waste disposal. And so by making solid waste more expensive to dispose of, it would encourage you first to reduce the amount of solid waste you're actually throwing out, reuse it if you can. So in your stuff that you could reuse, you could possibly reuse, or industry could recycle this stuff rather than just dump it. And recycle it, of course, and then the last resort would be to send it to a landfill. So the reduce, reuse, recycle, landfill concept came from the 1984 amendments to the RCRA, the Hazardous and Solid Waste Amendments. Okay, and lastly, we're going to wrap it up with this one. Probably we'll have to make another short lecture to do this. But this is the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act of 1980, better known as Superfund. And this emerged from a problem that started in 1959, wasn't resolved until the early 60s, called the Love Canal in New York. And this is within Niagara County in New York. So the Love Canal, what had happened is that actually, let me go ahead and stop it here, and then I'll pick it up in the next lecture.